Okay, so last up before morning tea, I'd just like to introduce one of my PhD students, Sam Guy, who's going to be sharing some really interesting work on cognitive effects of TBI in the prison population. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Well, I feel very underqualified after hearing some very impressive people talk about some very in-depth things. I suppose first I should introduce myself. Ko ngā te marutaki iwi ko tainui tō waka ko gai te whānau ko Sam aho. My name is Sam Guy. I am a PhD candidate under Alice, as she has mentioned, and Dr. Sue Mann, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. She's flying all around the world, enjoying Europe and vacations, and having a much more fun time than me in writing a thesis right now. So I'm going to be talking about my PhD work here today. I'm in the last stages. These are going to be the tentative results of my thesis, which I'll be submitting later on in the year, on the cognitive effects of TBI in offending populations. So to get you into the headspace of what I was coming into a few years back when I was sort of proposing this whole process, I saw these three variables here that you're seeing on screen of traumatic brain injury, the cognitive effects of traumatic brain injury, and how they were affecting offending populations. Offending populations experience traumatic brain injuries at a far higher rate for reasons that you could probably imagine. Lower socioeconomic status, tend to come from backgrounds of a lot of domestic violence. Also, in talking to guys, a lot of traffic injuries, on top of the normal amounts of injuries that you'd see from sports or whatever else guys are engaging in. But they skew quite high in terms of that. And they tend to have a different cognitive profile to the general population as well, on top of what we've already mentioned, that traumatic brain injury can affect your cognitive skills. So I saw this interaction here, and I saw a gap in the literature in terms of, are these offending populations actually being affected any differently? Because if there is a connective tissue here, are there rehabilitative approaches that we can use to maybe reduce the rate at which people are offending? So I figured, what belongs in that triangle? Me. I belong in that triangle. So to answer this, I have three studies that make up my thesis project. Firstly, just what we would consider a systematic review of the literature, looking at everything that's been done in this space previously, cognition by traumatic brain injury status in any sort of offending population, whether cognition around the time of injury or in response to the injury is actually predicting any antisocial or offending behaviour, and then finally, what's taken up the most of my time, running tests of cognition in a New Zealand prison population, as well as taking TBI histories for these guys and seeing what aspects of the traumatic brain injury history might actually be affecting their cognition. So, I will firstly touch on, perhaps we don't have a really strong foundation in the term cognition for everyone here. That can seem like a very big picture term. What I'm talking about is your brain processes, really. Your memory, your attention, your brain speed, all that kind of stuff that sort of gets grouped together under sort of the calculations that your brain has to do that can be affected by traumatic brain injuries. So here's what the literature looked like as I was beginning this process. I found 26 existing studies that were assessing traumatic brain injury and cognition in offending populations, and that they skewed quite male, 13 exclusively male studies, 3 exclusively female, and 8 mixed gender studies, which themselves were a 3-to-1 ratio in favour of men. The offending population in general skews quite male anyway, but as Dr. Valera mentioned earlier, work around traumatic brain injury with women is going to look a lot different than it does with men. There are some, sex characteristic factors there that are going to lead to those factors affecting women a little bit differently. So the fact that a lot of the research into offending women is a little bit, not necessarily weaker, but just a smaller pool of it. And the big outcome that I got here was that we have a really inconsistent method of assessing traumatic brain injury history, and the ways that we categorize traumatic brain injury severity is really inconsistent as well. So when we're asking someone about their traumatic brain injury history, how might we go about figuring out what that looks like? Well, you could go to their medical record, but as most of the people in this room will know, that's not always going to show up in there. A ton of people who experience just a mild concussion never have that registered with their provider. Oftentimes, it's only the most severe injuries that end up in a medical record. So we're reliant on people to self-report their history. And unless you're following a really strict protocol, the ways that you go about asking those questions might look really different, and it's going to give you different answers to the question of what your traumatic brain injury history looked like. And then inconsistent methods of talking about severity of traumatic brain injury. Generally speaking, we'll see categorizations of mild traumatic brain injury, what we think of as concussions. Moderate and severe is sort of the other categories that we'll often see, with mild traumatic brain injuries taking up the vast, vast majority of the injuries that people experience. But how these studies actually categorizing people is not remotely consistent. You'll see studies comparing no history to any history. That might not be the most appropriate because we know that the effects of severe TBI look a lot different than the effects of having, say, a single mild TBI. In terms of accounting for that single mild TBI, are we accounting for frequency at all in these variables as well, which is really inconsistent? Are people just being categorized by their single most severe instance? Well, then you're going to end up grouping people with 20 mild concussions with a person who's had one mild concussion, which those profiles tend to look very different. And what this ultimately means for this literature is that what you can't do is any sort of meaningful meta-analysis. What we would like to do with this sort of literature is sort of pull it all together and almost get to group these smaller studies into one larger big study, which we could say is, okay, here's something more meaningful that we could say than any of these individual smaller studies could. And it's just a real limitation of the existing literature. So 8 of those 26 studies were reporting cognitive differences by TBI history. So what those look like in terms of the kinds of differences that we're looking at, it's not isolated to a particular kind of offender. These were probation groups, their offences were very different. That wasn't limited to male-only or female-only populations, but the fact that so few studies were focused on women-specific populations really weakens the pool of literature in that space. And that where we were seeing the highest area of difference were in areas of what we'd call executive functioning. These are the cognitive skills that we would think of as sort of higher order cognitive functions: decision-making, inhibition, your ability to, make a good decision in the moment, which, if you're with me and we're working in the space of offending behavior, we can sort of connect potentially a relationship here to maybe this is a contributor. Cool. Alice and the Bionic team. The Bionic is a study that was taking place, the initial version of it in 2010 through 2011, which was a study of all of the cases of traumatic brain injury across the Waikato over this time period here. And it's a really fascinating bit of work, and it gives us an opportunity to do some longitudinal study here, study where we take people at the time of their traumatic brain injury and we can do some really meaningful follow-up with them. And they were kind enough to allow me to have a go at their data and use it to sort of assess what the long-term outcomes here were in terms of offending. So what I did, what the Bionic team did at the time was assess the cognition of people who experienced TBI at the time of TBI, within the acute, post-acute period, within the month following TBI. And then further follow-up at the 10-year mark to assess people for, are they reporting engagement in antisocial or offending behaviour, or are they in prison? So we ended up with 122 participants responded to the survey, or were imprisoned at that 10-year mark. And the areas where we saw some differences there were across the domains of processing speed, the rate at which your brain is actually taking in and understanding information, reaction time, sort of self-explanatory, and cognitive flexibility, which again is an associated term for those executive functions. How flexible your brain is operating, can you make good decisions, can you inhibit your own behavior? Unfortunately, well, potentially fortunately, none of these cognitive domains hold up once we're controlling for all the surrounding factors: substance abuse, age, sex, post-concussion symptoms, ethnicity. So none of that holds up once you're actually accounting for all these other factors. So it may well be that TBI isn't the biggest important factor for these people. there's a more complex story being told with their history. We don't want to emphasize or don't want to extrapolate too much from this. This is only a small group of offenders within this larger group that responded at that 10-year time period, but it's definitely not indicating an incredibly predictive power of cognition following TBI. And the final study here is a cognitive assessment of prisoners in Tongariro Prison, which is in Turangi here in New Zealand, in which I ran cognitive testing with a group of men and assessed their traumatic brain injury history across a lot of variables. The method that I used, as I mentioned, there's a lot of inconsistency there, was called the OSU TBI identification method. OSU just stands for Ohio State University. It's where it was developed, and it's a systematic way of going through and collecting someone's traumatic brain injury history. It's a convenient sample. The men volunteered to participate in this, but 58 of the 63 participants reported some history of TBI. In terms of the overall experience of TBI in the New Zealand prison population, estimates are in the range of around 70 to 80%. It's going to depend on the population you're working with, the kind of offence, the kind of prison that they're in. So not completely out of alignment with the general prevalence of traumatic brain injury in New Zealand prisons. That's the general distribution of causes there. Something notable in terms of the high rate of assaults and such. But for me, what I found most interesting was this really high rate of moderate and severe injuries. That might not look mild, still makes up the vast majority. But that is a really big, that 12% moderate and that 16% severe. That is a really large overrepresentation of those kinds of injuries compared to the general population. So there's something indicated in this group that they are experiencing a much more severe burden of TBI, or the TBIs that they're experiencing are more severe. Half the respondents had a first TBI prior to the age of 13, so quite early childhood, and there are some implications there on neuropsychological development. And 49%, essentially half again, reported a period of reoccurring TBI. So built into this measure, oftentimes people can't recall every single instance, especially if they grew up in an environment of domestic violence, for example, or potentially if they were in combat sports or even in elite sports in general. Maybe they're experiencing so many TBIs in a period that they couldn't give you an exact count. There are people here who are experiencing dozens and dozens of TBI. They're not going to be able to give you a count. That's what this is referring to here in terms of recurring TBI. And something to bear in mind around this prison population, Tongariro is a little bit different than the overall New Zealand prison. It is a minimum to low medium security with a really high proportion of segregated prisoners, not a remand group at all. Don't need to necessarily get into the weeds of this here, but this population might look a little bit differently. Their demographics and their offending types is a little bit different as well. If people are curious, I can get into that. Probably the most interesting stuff, though, is what the outcome of all this cognitive testing with these gentlemen was. So after we account for all those variables that I mentioned before, the substance abuse backgrounds, the age, the ethnicity, all that sort of stuff, we have a few key variables popping out still within the literature. So these are still significant, even accounting for everything else that we're seeing there. So the most severe injury, again, if someone's experiencing moderate or severe traumatic brain injuries, there's a few domains there that people are struggling with. Visual problem solving, planning and pattern recognition, those second two are, again, within that realm of executive functioning. The Traumatic Brain Injury Index, this is a figure whereby I essentially weight the injuries by their severity. So if a person has experienced more severe injuries and a greater number of them, they essentially get a higher score on this metric. It's a way of combining frequency and severity together into a single metric. And that contributed to some delayed memory, some memory concerns. Pervasiveness was associated with focus, inhibition problems, executive functioning. Age of first TBI, visual problem solving, again, a lot of executive functioning issues, multiple periods of pervasive TBI, so periods where someone maybe grew up in a domestic violence situation, then got into gang fighting as they got older, or had higher performing contact sports or something later on as well. So they had multiple periods of that really repetitive TBI space. And they were also struggling with those executive functioning things of inhibition. What's really notable here is that pure just number of TBI wasn't associated with any significant cognitive differences across the board here. And none of the domains that I was assessing could you take the number of traumatic brain injuries that a person has experienced just as a raw figure without accounting for anything else and see a significant difference between those groups. So that's a notable thing to come out of this, because oftentimes that is the figure that has been used in literature. On top of the fact that most of these are executive functioning under the umbrella of executive functioning, which is often the thing that's not going to get assessed in what you would think of as a typical IQ assessment, right? These measures of cognitive flexibility, of executive functioning, don't tend to go into what would be the traditional IQ assessments like a WACE, if you're familiar with anything like that, but it's not going to be measured in typical clinical day-to-day, generally speaking. And for a population like this that's experiencing a frequent rate of TBI and a more severe kinds of TBI, it sort of indicates that a lot of our tools that we're going to be using to measure aren't going to be appropriate for this group. And to me, that indicates that if these participants are struggling to reliably report their TBI or consistently report their TBI with the tools that we currently have, we'd probably see similar problems with other high exposure groups. Women in intimate partner violence relationships, high-level athletes, all these groups that are highly exposed and aren't going to be able to reliably report every single TBI that they experience. They're all going to need a more specific, adaptable tool to assess their traumatic brain injury history, because the tool that's going to be typical, that's going to be best for, say, me, who's had maybe 1 or 2 traumatic brain injuries in my life, isn't going to be as appropriate for them. Ultimately, what does that mean if you are here, you're a person who has a lived experience of TBI? What is the implications of this, really? I understand a lot of this is very big picture stuff. Simply having a mild TBI history, having a concussion history, doesn't necessarily mean your cognition is going to be severely impacted here, is what this sort of gets out. Oftentimes, and particularly with the men that I've spoken with, they have a lot of anxiety about the effects of traumatic brain injury. The sorts of conversations that, again, Josh mentioned earlier around, I don't feel capable, I feel as though this is almost like a death sentence for me in terms of what I'm hearing all of this stuff about CTE and these repetitive injuries and stuff, and there's a lot of anxiety induced from that. Raw having TBI history doesn't seem to be that associated here. What we are seeing meaningful relationships with is this repetitive, even mild repetitive TBI might be having some more significant effects, and that ultimately the relationship between TBI and offending is going to be very complex because of the nature of their backgrounds, the risk factors that they have in play. Having someone like Josh and Eve come before me is very fantastic because, as you can imagine, all of those risk factors for having worse mental health outcomes are the same risk factors for having worse cognitive outcomes. And finally, the final point there, and potentially a postdoctoral point for me, is to help develop some better tools for these really high exposure groups who need some tools to report their TBI history in a really reliable way that's going to allow for better accounting of both frequency and severity and causes as well in their experience. So that is me all good to go. If we have any questions, if people desperately want to run off for a cup of tea. Question? Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for that.
No worries.
Kind of a twofer.
Sure.
The first thing is, presumably this is a population with quite high rates of fetal alcohol syndrome.
Yes.
And so I'm just curious if you're interested in exploring, I mean, it's obviously very difficult to differentiate everything.
Yes.
And then I'll say my second part is I'm thinking about this being a group of people who are in a total institution and all the stresses of that environment and
Yeah.
what concussion recovery looks like
Yeah.
in an environment that is itself distressing, challenging.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So the first part of that was how do we account for something like fetal alcohol syndrome in this population, which is going to be very prevalent here. for the most part, fetal alcohol isn't going to be a thing that's going to be measured consistently within this group. And in terms of getting a diagnosis around fetal alcohol, you might be aware that that is a bit of a messy can of worms in terms of accounting for that, because of all of the breadth of variables that a prison population is going to have that doesn't align with the general population. That's sort of why they had to be compared to another prison population. That's why that's really difficult. I would like to see some more coverage on the rates of fetal alcohol in that group, but also very tentative around labeling with those groups as well. These guys know what that means often. They mention it, they talk about it. I try to be more focused on what the ultimate outcomes of this are. There is some evidence, I believe, of executive functioning in those areas being a little bit more associated with the fetal alcohol sort of a thing. Potentially a point to account for in the future, but very difficult considering the ways that that would go about getting diagnosed, whether corrections and stuff wants to have that diagnosed in that environment, and the lack of supports around that in the New Zealand healthcare system. The other thing was, how does recovery and rehabilitation look like? This is a stressful environment for these participants. How does that affect? And that's sort of what I was touching on before in terms of stress, sleep disturbances are all going to go into how effectively someone recovers. And it's why, again, you want to use a control group that's another offending population in the prison environment. And there is some evidence of the implications of what I have seen called cognitively malnutritious environments, in which people, are in a prison environment or something similar, and they aren't getting the opportunity to engage their brains. And we know that's a really important part of cognitive recovery here. I think that's an important piece for future research, because some of these participants are engaged far more than they would be on the outside. For example, Tongariro prison is a low, medium to minimum security facility. A lot of these men are going to be participating in work programs, education programs, that sort of stuff. So some of them are heavily engaged, and then some of them will be very disengaged. Some of them will be living their lives in front of a television screen and pretty disengaged. So having to account for that is, a significant component, and why getting to adjust for things like Josh mentioned as those risk factors is really important, and why I would suspect the prison population looks a little bit different to the general population. Hope that answers your question. Cheers. Is that my time?
Finish up there, if that's okay.
Sweet. I'd just like to thank the men who participated through the prison, as well as the bionic sample, because they are the ones who, they do all the work so that I can do this work. Cheers.
Kia ora.